She was sitting at the lunch table, surrounded by 10 people having a conversation, laughing, cutting each other off, talking with their hands, and she hadn't said a single word in 45 minutes. Someone finally looked over at her. "Why don't you ever talk?" they asked. Not mean, not cruel, just genuinely curious, maybe a little impatient. She smiled, and then she said something nobody in that room expected. "I talk when I have something worth saying." The table went quiet. Not for long, maybe 3 seconds, but you felt it, because in those 3 seconds, everyone at that table, including the loudest ones, understood something they hadn't before. Here's the thing about quiet people that most of us get completely wrong. We assume silence means discomfort. We assume that if someone isn't contributing to the noise, they must be struggling internally, too anxious, too nervous, too afraid to speak up. We treat quiet like it's a problem waiting to be solved, but that's not what was going on with her, and honestly, once she explained it, it made so much sense it was almost embarrassing that we hadn't seen it before. She told them, and I'm paraphrasing because I wasn't at that lunch table, but this is exactly the kind of story that travels because it hits something real. She told them that she had grown up in a house where everybody talked constantly, all the time, over each other, about nothing, and she had noticed, even as a kid, that all that talking wasn't doing anything. Nobody was actually listening. Words were just noise that people used to fill space. So she made a choice. She decided she would only speak when what she had to say was actually going to land somewhere, when it was going to mean something. This isn't a quirk or a personality flaw or some trauma response she needed to work through. What she was describing has real research behind it. Introverts, and she identified as one, process information differently than extroverts. This is not a social preference. This is neurology. Studies using brain imaging have shown that introverts have higher activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain involved in planning, reflection, and decision-making. They're running more internal processing before they respond. They're thinking before they speak. That's not a weakness. That's actually what most communication coaches will tell you is the ideal approach to any high-stakes conversation. Meanwhile, the research on social noise, on the sheer volume of words humans produce in group settings, shows that a massive percentage of daily conversation is filler. Small talk, social lubrication, verbal habits that exist to signal presence rather than convey actual information. Nothing wrong with that. It serves a social function, but it's not the only valid way to exist in a room. What she had figured out intuitively, without reading any of this research, is that restraint in speech is actually a form of respect for herself and for the people she's talking to. The person who asked her the question, let's call him Marcus, even though I don't know his name, apparently sat back in his chair and kind of laughed, not dismissively, more like he'd just been told something obvious that he should have known. And then he said, "Okay, fair," but it didn't stop there, because now the table was curious. They started asking her actual questions. What did she think about things? What she was working on? What she noticed? And she answered, calmly, clearly, with the kind of specificity that only happens when someone has been paying attention instead of waiting for their turn to talk. And apparently, by the end of lunch, Marcus looked at his friend across the table and said, "She's the smartest person here and none of us knew because we never shut up long enough to find out." That line is the whole story. Think about it. From the time we're kids, we're rewarded for participation. Raise your hand, speak up, don't be shy, share with the group. The extrovert ideal, the idea that confident, successful, likable people are the ones who fill the room, is so deeply embedded in most cultures that we don't even question it anymore. Quiet gets pathologized. It becomes something to fix. Job interviews penalize people who pause to think before answering. Meetings get dominated by whoever talks fastest. Leadership is unconsciously associated with volume, and so people who are naturally thoughtful, naturally internal, naturally selective about when they spend their words, they get overlooked. Not because they have less to offer, because they don't perform their value loudly enough for people who only know how to recognize loudness. Susan Cain wrote an entire book about this, Quiet, and it became a massive bestseller because millions of people read it and went, "Oh, someone finally said it." The research she cited showed that introverts are massively undervalued in workplaces, in schools, in social structures that were built by and for people who happen to process externally. The world, she argued, has a bias problem, not against any particular group, against silence itself. Here's what nobody tells you about the person at the table who isn't talking. They're watching, they're cataloging, they're tracking the dynamics, who's performing, who's genuinely engaged, who says one thing and means another, where the tension is, what the room actually needs versus what it thinks it wants. They're building a complete picture while everyone else is broadcasting half-formed thoughts. And then, when they do speak, and this is the part that shocks people every time, what they say lands differently. It has weight, because it didn't come from reflex. It came from somewhere. That's what happened at that lunch table. She spoke once in 45 minutes and it changed the entire vibe of the afternoon. One sentence, "I talk when I have something worth saying," and suddenly, everyone was recalibrating. I want to be clear about something because it matters. There is a difference between someone who is thoughtfully quiet and someone who is withdrawn because they're struggling. Anxiety, depression, social isolation, these are real things and they sometimes look like quietness from the outside. If someone is silent because they're drowning, that's a completely different situation and it needs care, not misinterpretation. What this story is about is the other kind of quiet, the intentional kind, the kind where someone has made a conscious choice about how they want to show up in the world, and that choice looks foreign to people who've never considered making it. The distinction matters because one requires support and the other requires respect. Conflating them, assuming all quiet people need to be coaxed out of their shells, is actually a little patronizing once you see it clearly. When she answered that question at lunch, she wasn't being defensive. She wasn't making a point. She was just telling the truth, simply, about who she was and how she operated. And the truth